As we mark this week the 60th anniversary of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's sichos on Rashi, we're going to dive into how the Rebbe engaged with some of the earliest print editions and medieval manuscripts of Rashi's commentary. These unique editions often reveal variant readings of Rashi's words, each with its own story to tell. We'll uncover what makes these manuscripts and early prints so distinct, and through this journey into Rashi's textual history, we'll gain a deeper appreciation for his foundational pirush and for the Rebbe's unique approach to understanding it. Links to the relevant manuscripts and prints are presented in the show's notes. In Parshas Noach, we have, after the story of the flood, after the Mabul, we have a pasuk that reads as follows. It says, Vayomer Elikim, and Hashem said, Zois ois habris asher ani noisein. This is going to be the sign of the covenant that I am placing beini uveinechem, between me and you, referring to Noach. And the pasuk concludes and says that this covenant is going to be ledoiros oila. It's going to be for everlasting generations. So Rashi addresses the words at the end of the pasuk ledoiros oilam, and Rashi notices that the spelling in the Sefer Torah of the word ledoiros is without either of the vavs. There is no vav following the dalid, and there is no vav following the resh. Says Rashi, ledoiros oilam. Nichtav chaser. It is written, chaser. Chaser means without those two vowels, without the vavs, without those vavs. Sheyesh doiros, because why is this? What is the significance of having a chaser? Sheyesh doiros, there are generations shaloi hutzruchu la'ois that don't need this sign. The sign that we're referring to over here is that Hashem says, I will never bring a mabul again, and the symbol is the rainbow. Some generations didn't need that sign. Why? Lefishet tzadikim gemurim hayu, because the people of the generation were perfectly righteous. Kemoi, for example, doiroi shel Chizkiyahu melech Yehuda, the generation of Chizkiyahu, the king, and a second example, v'doiroi shel Reb Shimon bar Yochai, the generation of Reb Shimon bar Yochai. So what's the chaser here? The pasuk makes it sound like you need this sign in every generation. L'doros olam. So the pasuk also tells you, by the way, not every generation. So we lost two of the vavs to tell you some generations actually didn't need this sign. They're perfect enough, they're righteous enough that they were okay. This is what Rashi says. Now the ending of this edition of Rashi that we're looking at, it says Beis Reish, which stands for Bereshis Rabbah, and this is not from Rashi himself. But the editors of this edition are telling you, and other editions as well do this, they tell you where Rashi got his material from. And they're saying that this comes from Bereshis Rabbah. Well, the Rebbe addressed this Rashi exactly 40 years ago in the Sicha of Shabbos Parshas Noach Tafshin Mem Hey. And the truth is, let's pause here, and before we get into what the Rebbe spoke about, really, if you go back 60 years ago to Shabbos Parshas Noach Tafshin Chaf Hey, 1964, we would have here what occurred at that Shabbos is something very famous in the history of Lubavitch. And that is the Rebbe began expounding upon and elucidating a Rashi, something that he then continued to do for many, many years thereafter, well into the 1980s. And so this is something that began exactly 60 years ago this week. Okay, appropriate therefore that we're going to focus this class on the concept of learning Rashi in general, and more in particular as it relates to many of the talks that the Rebbe gave over the years on this topic. So in this particular talk from Noach Tafshin Mem Hey, the Rebbe notes that there's actually a difference between the way the Medrash Rabbah speaks about this issue and the way Rashi speaks about this issue. Rashi writes, that there were generations that didn't need this. Rashi did not write 2 generations. And if you look at the Medrash, you'll see, the Medrash says there were only 2 generations. Rashi didn't say that. If you go back to the language of Rashi, Rashi said, there were generations that didn't need it. Why? Because if you're following the simple pshat, and that is derech Rashi, Rashi numerous times says he is here for nothing but the pshuto shel mikra. So according to that, it isn't necessary to say that there were only 2 generations that were good enough that didn't need the rainbow. And so therefore, Rashi kind of ignores that element in the Medrash. And the Rebbe does this a lot. The Rebbe will say that although Rashi is basing himself off on a Medrash, Rashi will change the words because Rashi wants to go in a different direction because his agenda is different. Specifically, his agenda is Pshuto Shel Mikra. So what's similar between the Medrash and Rashi is both of them are talking about the fact that the word L'doiros is chaser, and both of them are saying, yeah, there are some generations that didn't need the rainbow sign, but the difference is the Medrash says there were 2 generations, implying that there were only 2 generations in all of history, whereas Rashi just says there were generations. What is the significance of this? The significance of this is, as the Rebbe goes on to explain and brings from Mefarshim, is that there's really a different outlook in here on what's happening here in the Rashi. And I know this is a little technical, just for a minute, but bear with me because it's worth it to go where we need to go. According to the Medrash views this as bischus these great tzaddikim. And that is, you had 2 individuals who were such great tzaddikim that therefore they were such a positive influence in their generation that their generation, they were able to, so to speak, exempt their generation from any liability, and so they didn't need any rainbow sign or anything like that. So if you're talking about such a righteous person who's able to do this for his entire generation, then there's taka only 2 people. One was Chizkiah HaMelech and the other one's Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. Rashi, however, is taking a different approach. Rashi's approach is not talking about individuals who are, so to speak, standing for and helping their generation. Rashi is saying that there were full generations of people who more or less were acting righteously. Oh, full generation, so you don't need it's not such a big, in other words, to have one person have such a great sichos to be able to protect the entire door, that's a huge deal. So you only had 2 people in history for that. But if it's that there were some generations that are pretty decent behaving generations, and therefore they didn't need it, then who's to say there's only 2? There could be more. And that's why Rashi says, doesn't specify there being 2 generations. That's how he's different from the Medrash. But then the Rebbe continues and says, hold on a second. Isn't it the case that Rashi, at the end of the day, brought 2 examples? One was Chizkiah and one was Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. Says the Rebbe, because of Rashi, Chizkiah and Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, l'dugma nakat. He's not saying these are the only 2, he's just bringing 2 examples. In fact, if you look at Rashi's language, it makes a lot of sense. If you're medayik, if we get specific with the wording, the exact wording Rashi used, he said kimoi. He said kimoi. If you look back at Rashi, he didn't say these 2 generations. He said there were generations where everyone was righteous. Kimoi doiroi shel Chizkiyahu melech Yehuda v'doiroi shel Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. So it is kimoi, it is an example, and this is how the Rebbe is understanding this particular passage in Rashi, which really goes to show that part of this methodology, words are going to matter. Even one word. Here, the word kamoi matters so much. And here is another important point that I just want to say briefly. There are works that have been created by Gdolei Yisrael, and where it is not considered normative to be so medayik in their words. In fact, think about Mishnah versus Gemara. Mishnah, we're medayik very much. We get very, very specific about the wording of the Mishnah. The Gemara will ask, there's one extra word in the Mishnah that's a problem. But we don't really find that for the Gemara itself. The Gemara itself, you're not going to really find as a derech halimud where a Rishain is going to say that when the Gemara was asking the question, it could have asked it with one word shorter. That's just why. Because the Mishnah has its own style, the Gemara has its own style. And likewise, throughout history, there were different Gedolei Yisrael. And it's interesting, some of them, there's an assumption that they were very specific with their words. Others not. The Rebbe was very particular about the words of Rashi, looking at each individual one, teaching. The Rebbe wasn't the first to do this. There were others who also pointed out that we need to be medayek with the specific words of Rashi. Here's a good example, the word kimoi. Okay, except there's one thing. There's a footnote. There's a footnote by the word kimoi. And this is going to really open up the conversation that we're going to have in this lesson today. What's the footnote? It's footnote 9. And it says as follows: Beroiv kisvei yad Rashi shetachas yodi or tachas yodenu. In the majority of manuscripts of Rashi that are in our possession or in my possession, leisa tevas kimoi. The word kamoi is actually not there. So the Rebbe just made a big deal out of the word kamoi. Well, guess what? There are in the majority of manuscripts that I have, the word is actually not there. Okay, that's one thing. Number 2, Uvidfus Rishon, and in the first edition, the first printed edition of Rashi, in fact, it doesn't have the word kamoi either. It has the word hayu, which the Rebbe points out doesn't actually make sense, and it seems to be a tois hatfus. Okay, seems to be a mistake. Then the Rebbe goes on to say, Avol yashna b'tfusei Rashi anafutzim. However, this word kamoi, which we have in our standard Rashi today, you do have it in the popular editions, including ubitfus beis. In the second edition, the printed edition of Rashi, rather than the word kamoi, you have kigoin, but it's the same thing. So what happened over here? What happened over here is that the Rebbe mentioned us a few things. There is kisvei yad, there's the manuscripts of Rashi that the Rebbe says is in my possession. There is the tfus rishon, there is the popular prints, there is the tfus sheni, the second prints. And I want to know what is the Rebbe referring to here in terms of the manuscripts? What is he referring to the first print? What is he referring here to the second print? Okay. Let's continue. There's another talk from the Rebbe. This is the second sicha of Chayei Sarah in Lekutei Sichos Chelek Tezvav. Here we're not going to get into the specifics of what the Rebbe is addressing over here. We are just going to jump into footnote number 3, where the Rebbe addresses the language of Rashi, and he says, Keinu agirsa beroyev hatfusim shalafanenu. The Rashi, the way I just told you what he says, that is how the majority of prints we have today have Rashi. However, Avol B'tfus Rishon V'Sheni, in the first print and in the second print, the Kisvei Yad of Rashi, Yashnam Kama V'Kama Shenuyim, there are numerous variations. V'nismu L'Kaman Achodim Mehem, and throughout this Sikha, I am going to indicate a number of them. V'Akarav Yeser L'Girsa Shalafanenu, and which one is the closest to what we have? Hu B'tfus Sheni, the second edition. The Yadua, and it is well known, it's a better edition than the first edition, and it's better than many of the manuscripts of Rashi. It's better than Kama Kisvei Yad Rashi. V'chasum alav, and the signature on the second print is Reb Shlomo Alkabetz, Zkeino Shel Baal Lechadoidi, the grandfather of the author of Lechadoidi, that Shlomo Alkabetz, who lived in the 16th century eventually in Eretz Yisrael. Here it's his grandfather whose signature is on this Sefer Shehugal Yodai, that he edited it. So here again, we see the Rebbe mentioning, I mentioned something about how Rashi is. Well, there's a first print, and there's a second print, and there's manuscripts, and in some of them, it's not really that way. Along the way, the Rebbe says a second edition, because Alkabetz is involved, so it's a preferred edition. And then he goes on and says, Ulahoyer, by the way, Yesh Oimrim, some people say, Shezeu Tfus Gimel, that this, meaning what I've been calling Tfus Sheni, is actually Tfus Gimel, is the third print. What does this mean? What does it mean? Some are saying that the second print is the third print. Let's go to another example. This is in the same Sikha, footnote 15. The Rebbe says, it would have made more sense if Rashi would have said whatever he was talking about in an opposite order. But our standard editions don't have it that way, which raises a question. However, V'cheinhu, Bebeis Kisvei Yad Rashi, 2 manuscripts actually have it in the way that's more intuitive, which is different from the way we have it. And then it goes on to say, dates. Hey Aleph, Hey Aleph, and Kuf Lamed Aleph, and Hey Aleph, Kuf Ayin Gimel. These are signs to know which manuscripts we're talking about over here. I want to know what are these manuscripts? What exactly is the Rebbe referring to here? One more example. Here is a Sikha from the Rebbe on Lekutei Sichos Chelek Lamed Hey Vayetzei Aleph. It's again a Rashi Sikha. He notes as follows: V'cheinhu b'tfus rishon. This is the way it's in the first print. And Tfus Sheni, and Kama Kisayad Rashi, numerous manuscripts of Rashi, Shetachas Yodi or Tachas Yodenu, that we have. However, in other manuscripts have it differently, and then he goes, Val Dera Zebet Tfus Roma. So too it is in the print of Rome. And here I'm going to say that as we learn the many, many sichos of Rashi sichos and Lakuta sichos, there are literally hundreds of times that the Rebbe refers to variations in the text. And that's because the Rebbe is very interested in the exact language of Rashi, both to give answers and to ask questions. And as a result, when you're getting very specific about words, all of a sudden, if the words are different in some other prints, then that matters. And so when you're learning a Rashi Sikha, very, very often there's going to be in the footnotes a parallel discussion about, well, the question is actually not a question according to this edition. Or the answer is not an answer that works according to this edition. When the Rebbe does this discussion, typically he refers to Tfus Rishon, he refers to Tfus Sheni, which we saw him say, some people say is the third print. And we see here an example of him referring to Tfus Roma, so it's 3 printed editions of Rashi he's referring to. He refers very often to Kama Kisvei Yad, numerous manuscripts, Shetachas Yodi or Tachas Yodenu, that we are in possession of, that we have. And that's pretty much the material that the Rebbe is working with throughout the years in order to establish the proper text for Rashi, or in order to learn the Rashi in a proper way. These are the ones that he's referring to. There are, of course, many, many printed editions of Rashi. The Rebbe usually is only referring to Tfus Rishon, Tfus Sheni, and as we saw over here, Tfus Roma as well. We want to know what are these editions. Also, what are these manuscripts that the Rebbe is referring to? So, if you go to the library website of Agudas Chasidei Chabad, you'll see there's numerous, they have cataloged there the different manuscripts, and there are numerous manuscripts over there of Rashi that are listed. Let's go through them quickly. So, first of all, there's a manuscript that is a Yemenite manuscript, a Yemenite handwriting. It says that this manuscript was brought by Rabbi Shmuel David Reichik and was gifted to the library. This, however, is not what the Rebbe is referring to in almost all of these cases, because it covers a very small portion of the Torah from Shmois Perek Beis to Shmois Perek Tezayin. So this is only a partial manuscript, so this isn't really relevant to our conversation. The second manuscript is known as Cambridge 1335. This is in the Cambridge University Library. And as you can see in the catalog, this is not an actual manuscript. The Yemenite one is an actual manuscript. That is there. Rabbi Reichik brought it. It's their actual original. This is Cambridge 1335, is obviously in Cambridge. Someone went there and copied. I don't know exactly who, and I don't know when, but copied the entire Rashi manuscript. And so a tzilum of this manuscript was available throughout the years for the Rebbe. That is 1335 Cambridge. Number 3, the next one is also a tzilum, also a copy, this one, from a manuscript that's known as Vatican VIII. The Vatican has many important Judaic manuscripts, including numerous ones of Rashi, and this one, Vatican VIII, and the catalog here gives us some information about the dating of this manuscript, which we'll get to in a moment. So this is another one of those manuscripts. Number 4 is Vatican number 46. This Vatican number 46 comes from the year Kuf Mem Hey. It says this in the colophon of the manuscript. Again, it's only a copy in the library over here. Comes from the year Kuf Mem Hey, which is the year 1385. Manuscript number 5 is Vatican 47. Vatican 47 we'll talk more about momentarily. So we'll come back to Vatican 8 and Vatican 47 in a moment. And finally is Cambridge 1828. This is from the year 1482. That's information that again comes from the colophon of this manuscript. So as far as I can tell, there's about 5, maybe there's stuff that's not listed in the catalog or isn't cataloged properly. But following the catalog, there's 5 manuscripts that the Rebbe seems to be referring to when he says the manuscripts of Rashi that are Tachas Yadi or Tachas Yodenu. He's referring to these 5 copies of manuscripts that were made from various libraries in Europe, specifically 3 from the Vatican, 2 from Cambridge. And there are important differences between these manuscripts and the printed editions. And so, and as the 2 manuscripts that the Rebbe referred to before and gave the dating for them, as I'm going to show you in a moment, that is the 3rd one that's on the screen before you, which is Vatican VIII, and the 5th one that's on the screen on the top left, which is Vatican 47. So when he gave the years, he's referring to those 2, and I'll show you how we know that in a moment. So let's have a look actually at these manuscripts. So here is Vatican VIII. This is the one that was written in 1371. Here is the opening of Bereshis Bara Elikim, the first Rashi of the Torah. Most of these Rashi manuscripts does not present the text of Chumash. It only presents the Rashi. The Chumash you have elsewhere, and the job of this manuscript is only to give you the text of Rashi. Let me just be very clear. These texts are not the original autographed copies of Rashi. Those don't exist. No one knows. Those have not survived. Rashi's autographed copies of his commentary. This is referring to copies that were written by specific scribes in Europe during the Middle Ages. This one specifically in the year 1371. I'll make it a little bigger so we can have a look. You can see Bereshis Bara Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Lo Hoya Sarach La'askal HaTorah Ela Ma'achodesh Azalachem. That is the famous words of Rashi. If you go a little higher up, you should be able to see where it says right over there, Pirish Chumash Me Rabbeinu Shloima, the commentary of Rabbeinu Shloima. On the left-hand side over here is a Balaturim style commentary, doing gematria work, though it does not appear to be the Balaturim. By the way, I should point out over here, you see the watermarks of the Vatican, all of their manuscripts that they put up online. Unlike most other libraries that just give it to you, they have this watermark that's present on each and every individual page. Okay, let's go to the end of this manuscript, and this is how we know where these manuscripts came from. And what does it say? It says, Nishlam Pirush Chomesh, the Pirush of Chomesh has been completed. Asher Piresh Amar Hagadol Rabbeinu Shlomo Zatzal, that was explained by the Moir Hagadol Rabbeinu Shlomo, that's Rashi. V'nigmar, and it's done b'shlishi, b'Shabbos on a Tuesday, b'Shiva Aser L'Yerach, Teves on the 17th of Teves, Shnas Chamesha Salafim 5,000, Meya, that gets us to 1340, Ushloshim 1370, Ve'echad 1371, Lebrias Oila. Okay? And here he gives you the scribe, the Nichtav, Aidei Shloima, his name is Shloima, the son of Elia, some acronym there. Okay? And he wrote it, V'kasafti, why did I write this manuscript? For Aaron Achi, his brother Aaron. May Hashem bless him that he should be able to learn it, him and his children, Ad Sof Kol Hadoros, and the pasuk that says the following pasuk should become true for him, namely Lo Yamush Sefer HaTorah Mipicha Mipizaracha Mipizera Zaracha Amar Hashem Me'atav Adolam Amen V'Amen Amen. And then it says V'schar Tirchasi Kibalti Miyadei Mishalem, and the it's a receipt, essentially. The money that because he commissioned me to hire this, I have received my payment in full, and this is the Colophon. So this comes out to the year 1371. So if you go back to this sicha of the Rebbe, where he says, V'chein hu bebeis kiso yad Rashi, He alaf kuf lamed aleph, He alaf kuf lamed aleph is the year 1371. He's referring to this one that we're calling Vatican VIII. Okay, that's this manuscript. Let's go to the next one. This is Vatican 47. This is later. This comes from the year 1413. And this is the other one in that same footnote that the Rebbe was referring to, also from the Vatican. Here you can see is the beginning of Parshas Noach. This is actually a nicer handwriting. Eile told us Noach. You'll notice over here that the Dibur HaMaschil gets, how do you determine what's the difference between a Dibur HaMaschil and the text of Rashi? The Dibur HaMaschil, each word gets like quote marks on top of it. And that's how you know it's a Dibur HaMaschil. Eile told us Noach ish tzaddik. That's the first Dibur HaMaschil here. Okay, here. B'doi roisov is a Dibur HaMaschil. Okay, so each Dibur HaMaschil is highlighted by quote marks on top. The reason this is important is because a lot of what the commentaries do, and the Rebbe does this a lot, is actually trying to analyze where does a Dibur HaMaschil really end and where does a commentary begin. Sometimes it's not so clear, and there's a lot of work and commentary that goes into this issue. Let's go to the back of this manuscript. Here is all the way at the end, and this is where Rashi finishes his famous remarks about Le'inei Kol Yisrael Yashar Koyach Asher Shibarta. Yashar Koyach Asher Shibarta. Let's have a closer look at this Rashi. Here he says, Yashar Koyach Shibarta. That's the last word in the standard editions of Rashi that we have at the end of Parshas Zos Bracha. This one says, Ashrei Talmid Sheraboy Moida Loi. Praise the student who the teacher, the master, says you're right. Words of saying, look how great Moshe Rabbeinu is, that God said Yashar Koyach Shibarta, but those are extra words that we do not have in our Rashi. We'll come back to that later on. Once that's done, then you get a colophon. The colophon here says that Vatishla Malechas Havodas HaKodesh Aidei Moshe, the son of a name like Eliah, when B'Shishi B'Shabbos Friday, the second of Chodesh Adar, the year 5000, Umeya V'Shivim Ushloisha Lebrias Oilam. So that is the dating. As I said, that amounts to the year 1413. That's the second manuscript that the Rebbe is referring to over here. And as I said, this too, a copy of it was used very often. Many sichos of the Rebbe, where he is referring to the Kisvei Yad of Rashi, Shatachas Yodenu. Now, if you go back here, and you're looking well at this last page of this Rashi manuscript, I hope you're able to see that in addition to the Vatican's watermark, that circle in the middle of the page, you're also able to see the outline of a menorah. Does anyone see it? You see the outline of a menorah? Okay, why is there an outline of a menorah on this final page? That's because you have to go to the next page. If you go to the next page, this is the next page in the manuscript. In other words, the recto, the right-hand side of the page, is the menorah, and the opposite side is that last page of Rashi, and so that's why the other way around. Rashi is the recto, and the menorah is the verso on the same page, which is why the menorah kind of leaked through. And on the left-hand side, you have the krushim for the Mishkan, as well as the lechem haponim. What is this doing here? This connects to a class we did a number of years ago, where we spoke about the fact that, especially in Spain and Portugal, there was this thing in the Bible manuscripts and the Chumashim to, usually in the beginning, to celebrate having the Kalim of the Beis HaMikdash. And we discussed at great length then why this was done. I'm not going to repeat what we said then. You can go back and you can listen. This seems to be similar to that, though it's not a Chumash manuscript per se, but it is a Rashi. This would be one explanation, or perhaps it's different. Perhaps this was really about, well, Rashi describes the Kalim of the Beis HaMikdash in Parshas Truma, so maybe it's not that explanation that we gave then. Maybe it literally is more about being a learning aid. For that, you need to study this a little closer to be able to give an answer. So those are two possibilities. So that's in terms of the manuscripts. I showed you 2 of the 5 that are present in the catalog to give you a little taste, a feel for what these things look like, and some of the variations that are there. We focused on one of them at the end of the Torah, and we will come back to it momentarily. Okay, now let's move to the era of printing. When we come to the era of printing, that is in the middle of the 15th century, is the invention of the printing press, and this really introduces major changes into the dissemination of knowledge, and more specifically for our purposes, the dissemination of Torah. Suddenly, in order to have a Rashi, you don't have to copy the whole thing by hand. You're able to buy much cheaper, something that's produced rather quickly, the printings of Rashi. We're going to talk now about the first edition of Rashi. Remember, the Rebbe kept on referring in these sichos, and I hasten to add again, he goes back to it many dozens of times, maybe even hundreds of times, to this Defus Rishon, the first edition. We're going to talk about this first edition, though we're going to qualify that a little bit later on. So on the screen you see a picture of Giovanni de Rossi. He was a Christian Hebraist who lived between 1742 and 1831. He was a professor at Parma University, that's in northern Italy. He had a huge collection of Judaica, about 1,500 manuscripts and about 1,500 printed books. All of these eventually went over to the university in Parma, where they are today. So this is a very important collection of Judaica. And this library has, in this De Rossi collection, has the one and only almost complete copy of this first edition of the printing of Rashi, which, as I'm going to show you, happened in 1475, and I'll tell you how we know that momentarily. You're looking here at the very first page that's available. It's in Perek Gimel of Bereshis, talking about the Chet Eitz Hadas. The first few pages do not exist. But from here, it goes all the way to the end. Here is the beginning of Parshas Noach of this edition, and I'm going to make it a little bigger so that you're able to see it. You're able to see Es Ha'alekim is Halech Noach. This is the Dibur HaMaskil of Rashi, and once in a while you'll see there's a dot in between words. Not always, but often that's telling you the previous Rashi is finished. Now there's a new Dibur HaMaskil. Okay, but what you don't have over here is you don't have that the end of the Dibur HaMaskil gets a dot. And so there is actually some confusion of where does the Dibur HaMaskil end and where does Rashi begin. So for example, his Halech Noach, that's a Dibur HaMaskil. Lashon Avar. So there is no dot over there, and that again leads to the thing we spoke about before of trying to determine what's the Dibur HaMaskil and what is commentary. This is this first edition always becomes part of that conversation. Let's go to the end of the Rashi, the mamish, the ending of Parshas Zos HaBracha. It finishes at the bottom of the page. I'll make it a little bigger so that we can see. You see, it says Tam v'nishlam tehila lekeil oilam. A praise to Hashem. Let's look at the last words. Asher shibarta, yashar koichacha shibarta. Now remember, that's where our edition ends. This one has additional words. What does it say? Ashrecha, and then it tapers off, and it's not clear because the ink got smudged and the paper got ripped and you can't really read it. But what's clear is, it does not say here what the other manuscript said. That manuscript that I showed you before, it said, Ashrei Talmid Sharaboy Moidaloi. There is no way that this says, Ashrei Talmid Sharaboy Moidaloi. And so there's a lot of speculation. Some people say, maybe it says, Ashrecha b'misasecha. You are praised in your death. Maybe it says, Ashrecha b'zeh u'bevoy. You are praised in this world and in the next one. I don't think anyone could really know. There's just not enough here to really tell us what is being said over here. Now, before we continue to the colophon of this first edition, the Rebbe spoke about this final Rashi on numerous occasions. And the Rebbe asked the question of why is this an appropriate way to finish the Torah? You're talking about the breaking of the Torah at the end. Remember, it invokes the Chet HaEgel. Why is this a good idea for Rashi to conclude his work with this? And then in footnote 24 in Lakota Sichos, Chelek Tes, page 239, the Rebbe says that there's Noisef Latmiya, there's another question. Shetzarech L'sayim b'toiv, that generally speaking, you're supposed to end on a positive note. V'yesh loymar, and we can suggest Shemitam Zeh Moisef Rashi, and therefore Rashi adds Lefi HaNusach Shebetfus Rishon, according to the text in this first edition. After it says Yashakech Sheshibarta, it says Ashrecha ... And then beneath that the Rebbe says Ba'atzilum Shemitfus Rishon, in the copy of the first print. We'll talk more about that later. Mitushtash, it's not clear. V'tzarech birur, we need clarification in terms of what it's saying. Uvekama kisei yad Rashi shetach yodenu, numerous manuscripts that we have, including the one we saw before. It says Ashrei Talmid Sharabai Moidaloi. So here you see the Rebbe using that manuscript that we saw before. He's also referring to this first edition and saying that there's a logic behind the version, the nusach in this first edition, because by ending Yashakech Shashibarta, breaking of the luchas, that's not a siyum toiv. If, however, you say Ashrecha, that whatever, we're not sure what the last words are, then that means you are doing a siyum b'toiv, you are concluding on a positive note, and so that would explain why this version exists. There's more to be said about the different versions, which we will do, but let's continue on to, I said before, this book is from 1475. How do we know? We know because of the print colophon that is at the end. And in fact, this is the oldest Jewish book with a colophon, which means, in a certain way, you could say this is the oldest printed Jewish book because it's dated. It has clearly a year, as we're going to see. So we want to focus on the bottom, the last 3 lines of this colophon. There's a long poem where the person writes a lot about his work over here. We're not going to have the time to read all of it. He says some interesting things here. One thing you'll notice is he ends every line of this poem with Avraham, and that's because, as you're going to see, his name was Avraham. So the printer is therefore celebrating his name. Now he writes over here. He writes, Ani ben Gartoin. I am the son of Gartoin. So there's an assumption that that's more like a family name or something like that. Ben Yitzchak, that's his father's name. Avraham, the assumption is that this is his name, not that he's Ben Yitzchak, not that his father's name was Yitzchak Avraham, but he's Ben Yitzchak. His name is Avram Ben Yitzchak, the family of Garton. And that's why people refer to the printer of this book as Avram Ben Yitzchak Garton. Reggio Hamedino. Reggio is a area in Calabria. Calabria is southern Italy. Here's Calabria is this region at the toe of Italy, all the way at the south, and Reggio is one of the cities in Calabria, and that's like Mamish at the south, all the way down here. So there was a Jewish community that was here during the 1400s, links with Spain. The Jews are expelled from here in the 1500s because the Spanish have control of Calabria, and just like they expelled their Jews from Spain in 1492, they do so from this region in southern Italy as well in the 1520s. But back in the 1400s, there are Jews living there, including him, and he writes. So he's in Reggio Hamedina, Da'al Yama Moisava, that sits on the sea. Right, Reggio is a coastal town. Be Soif Calabria, at the end of Calabria, because it's all the way south Calabria. Sham Gar Avram, that's where I live. So he's telling you he lives there. Then he goes, Li Yitzira, from creation, it's Hey Alafim, 5,000, Masayim. Okay, so that already gets you, you're in 1440 right now. Vehei Vishloishim, now you're in 1475. And then he gives a date, B'Yud Ba'adar, Soif Chadashim, in the Adar, which is the last month, L'Cheshban Avram, to the Cheshban of Avram, the Jewish way of counting. So it's printed, this book is printed in Reggio of Calabria, in the month of Adar, in the year 1475. We have a colophon, we know who did this, and this is the earliest dated printed Jewish book. And when Rebbe refers to Rashi Dfus Rishon, this is the book that he is referring to. You have it all the way from Parag Gimel in Bereshis, all the way until the end. There's one edition that's in Parma in northern Italy. Now, if so, how did the average person have access to this? So the answer is that in 1969, they printed a facsimile edition of this. Rashi was printed in Eretz Yisrael, literally copies, and sold. They sold 200. It was like a collector's item. They sold 200. They made and sold 200 of these. I didn't check. I assume one of these, starting from 1969, would have been in the library over here, and this was being used. This is my assumption. Now, what's interesting is that in addition to all of this, there so happens to be that there's I know of 2 places in the world where they have individual pages of this edition of Rashi. One of them is, I believe, in the JTS there are 2 pages. There are also 2 pages of this edition of Rashi, clearly from a different copy, not from the same copy. 2 of them are here in the library. Original pages, not copies. 2 original pages. Here you're looking at one of them. This comes from Parshas Vayechi. You can tell it's the exact same style. It's the exact same edition. You match it up. It fits perfectly. So even though we don't have the colophon, we know this is for sure that Reggio Calabria 1475 edition. How does the library have 2 pages? Why are there 2 random pages from this edition in the library here in Agudah Chassidut Chabad? So the answer to that is something we once spoke about, and we'll briefly just summarize it one more time. In the era of print, when they used to create book bindings, the bookbinders will look for old scrap paper in order to form the spine and to tie the book together. And so they used to take old paper. Old paper included old books. Old books sometimes included pages from old Svarim. And so in the 20th century, this was kind of discovered that anyone who has books that were bound in the 1500s or in the 1600s or maybe even in the 1700s, there's a good chance that if you open up the binding, you will find pages of even older Svarim. Sometimes this is called books within books. The books within books. So all the libraries started making their investigation to figure out what do they have. And so many libraries found individual pages from interesting works, some of which were in fact unknown. That's how these two pages were found in the binding of books here in the library. This was well known to the poskim of the day that this was happening. The Magen Avram, writing in the 1600s, writes in Oire Chaim Simin Kuf Nun Dalid, he writes, Tamani al Gdolei Adar, I'm surprised about the great rabbis, Shein Moichin, that they don't protest. B'ha'oisim b'dapei asfarim, those who make with the pages of the books, Kisvei HaKodesh, Kisha Koshren Oisoi. The exact intention of how to touch it in the words, I'm not 100% sure, but he clearly here is referring to this idea where you're using holy svarim that are no longer in use, and you're using them to form your binding of books. Kisha Koshrim Oisai. And he says, Isser Gomer, this is definitely prohibited, because it's descending from a higher state of Kedusha, a real sefer, and now, instead of being a sefer, it's just a book binding. Veroy legoinzon, it should rather these should be buried, shaloyu menuchim bebuzayin, that they should not be in this disgraceful situation. He's not the only one who wrote about this. There were other Rabbanim going back to the 1500s even that wrote about this, and so this was a well-known phenomenon. That's how 2 pages of this edition made their way to the library. I don't believe it is known in which Svarim they were found. I think that's a standard practice, is to, when you extract the binding, to actually keep track of where it was found, because that can be important, but as far as I can tell, that wasn't done in this case over here. So much, this is for the first edition of the Rashi of 1475. Now the Rebbe kept on referring to, and does this so many times, the second edition. And if you remember, he said he associated with Al-Kabitz, and he said that this one is in fact better than the first edition. So here we're looking at the beginning of Parshas Noach in the second edition. There's only one full copy in the world from this edition. This is in Verona, in Italy. The copy is in such good shape because it was never used. Why was it never used? It's sitting. It was in a monastery for many years, and so this is the only surviving copy of this. It was discovered in the 1930s, as I'll show you in a minute. So here is. It looks very similar to the first edition in style. Let's go to the end. Let's go to the back, the last page. Here you have the Yashar Koyach Asher Shibarta without any addition over here, which is more similar to the Rashi that we have without any addition. And then you have over here, in block letters, this is the colophon. This is where the printer is going to tell you a little bit about where he is and what he's doing. And here again, there's a lot of interesting things that are written in a poetic way. We're not going to spend too much time on this. I want to focus on the left-hand side, which is over here. And specifically, let's look over here where he writes, V'hamichtav hu bitsura. The writing is bitsura tzayer chadash, a new artist. Samcheni, who's made me happy. His name is Pedro. So Pedro is a non-Jew who made the script. What does it mean he made the script? He set the type. He carved out the type. Creating type was a big malacha gedola, creating the metal that's used for the pressing of the letter. And here he's giving the guy's name. His name was Pedro. And where is he? So it says over here, Vad al-Chagara. Vad al-Chagara. In Spain, there's a city today known as Guadalajara. Here, I'll show it to you on the map. Guadalajara is where you have this red symbol over here. It's a little northeast of Madrid, not too far from Madrid. Now, remember, Spain is once very Moorish, Arabic speaking. And so this place, before it's called Guadalajara, is called Wadi al-Hajira. Wadi al-Hajira. Wadi means a valley of sorts. And so the Valley of Al-Hajira, that's the Arabic name, and from there it turned into eventually to Guadalajara, and then we get a city in Mexico, Guadalajara as well. Okay, so Pedro, the guy who created the type, is in Guadalajara. I'm just going to start calling it Guadalajara now. Now here he writes about himself at the end. He says, Poi ha'ir Guadalajara, Vad al-Chagara, B'sheish be'elul al-Asara. 6th Elul al-Asara, So this means presumably the 16th of Elul, 6/10, meaning the 16th of Elul. Shnas El Har Ya'aleini Ulechol Yisrael B'Mehera. To a mountain I should be taken up, and all of the Jews quickly. So that's the year. He gave us the year. El Har Ya'aleini Ulechol Yisrael B'Mehera. And then he goes and he says, Zeshmi Vehein Tavi, this is my name, this is my inscription, Shloima ben Alkabetz Halevi. I am Shloima from the family of Alkabetz. This, as we said before, the Rebbe referred to Shloima, the Alkabetz, the grandfather of the author of Lechadoidi, who later lived in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, now the big issue here is figuring out what is this year. What is this year, El Har Ya'aleini? And then you have the words of L'chol Yisrael b'Mehera. So, and also notice that on top of the har, there is a dot. There is a period on top of the hey. So this is actually not a simple matter at all. And the person who discovered this printed edition, his name was Yeshaya Zun. In 1937, he wrote an article about this discovery that he made in a journal called Kiryas Sefer. And so he says the following. Clearly there's a year going on over here. But what is it? Is it this whole thing, El Har Ya'aleini? Is that the whole thing, that the year? So if you go El Har Ya'aleini, that's Gematria 406. So if you're counting from the year 5406, that gets you to 1646. There are no Jews in Spain. There's no printing of Rashi in 1646. So obviously we can't do that. So this is not, the whole phrase cannot be the year. All right, so let's take out the word Ya'aleini. Let's focus just on the word Har. In fact, there's a dot over that word, so maybe that's a sign to say only count that word. Well, that's Gematria 205. 205 from the year 1240 gets you to 1445. 1445, there was no printing it. That's mamish when Gutenberg is getting started. I don't know exactly Gutenberg's year, but definitely in Spain there is no printing. So that also doesn't work. So his only solution is to say that you have to count El Har. El Har, if you count both of them, comes out to 236. 236 plus 1240, because the year 5000 is 1240. So 5000 plus 236 is the year 1476, which would make it 1 year after the first edition, which is why the Rebbe keeps on calling it Ksav Yad, Tfus Sheni, the second print, because we're basically going, due to lack of any better option, with the year 1476. I don't think it's conclusive, especially the fact that there's one dot over just the hay. Makes it very odd that we need to count the El Har, all of it together. I'm not saying I have a better solution, but this is pretty much where things stand, and the assumption today is that this is Guadalajara 1476, the second edition of Rashi. Now, I showed you before that the Rebbe in one of the footnotes said, some people say this second edition is the third edition. What does that mean? What does it mean? Some people say the second edition is the third edition. So what does that do to the first edition? So the answer to this question is as follows. Over the course of after World War II, it became apparent that there were a number of books that were printed in Rome between the year 1469 and 1472, which is before any of the books we were speaking about. About 9 different Svarim were printed over there, and it is generally assumed, and this mostly comes from judging the type and the paper, especially the watermark. Paper has watermarks, and that the companies that produce the paper. So these watermarks can be analyzed and then compared with other things, and based on that you can figure out when these books were printed. Well, the analysis led that these 9 books were printed in Rome between 1469 and 1472. The problem is they have no colophon. No colophon means there's no information whatsoever about it. So they're not dated. So no one can really say anything definitive about it. One of these 9 books is this Rashi that you see right here on the screen. Unlike the other 2 prints that I showed you, which were written in what we call today Rashi script, which is the way Sephardim wrote cursive, this one is written in block letters. The whole thing in block letters. I'll make it a little bigger for Parshas Noach, where you're able to see here the style for a Dibur HaMaschil. You're also able to see, so let's look at example, Vatishaches ha'aretz. So he puts dots over the words. Actually, that's in this case, he actually only puts dots over the first and last word. Ki hishchis kol basar, there's a dot over the ki, and there's a dot over the basar, not over the words in the middle. Okay, so that's the style of this particular edition. So the idea is that basically this is assumed to be the first printing of Rashi. And that's what the Rebbe, I think, means over there. Yesh oimrim, that the second print is really the third one, because the first one is really the second one, because this one is really the first one. And so that's pretty much, it's really interesting to me that all kind of this is going on in the footnotes in Likutei Sichos without much explanation, and you have to actually go and do the work to actually figure out what's happening over here. But that seems to be the case. This is not used very often by the Rebbe. And I mentioned before, the Rebbe said, V'cheinu b'tfus Roma. That's this. V'cheinu b'tfus Roma. So a few times in Likutei Sichos, the Rebbe refers to the Roman, to the edition printed at Rome, very few. The Tfus Aleph and Tfus Beis, meaning Reggio and Guadalajara, hundreds of times referring to it. But this one, a handful of times where the Rebbe is referring to it, I don't think it was available. I don't know if facsimile copies were ever made, and generally awareness about this was considerably less. By the way, this edition is also, I believe there's only one, and it's also in the same De Rossi collection in Parma. This Rome Rashi. Okay. Let's continue. I think I gave a little bit of an overview over here about when the Rebbe's style in terms of trying to determine the proper text of Rashi, or at least the variations within Rashi. We looked at two of the manuscripts that the Rebbe was looking at, and we looked at a few of the key early printings that the Rebbe is referring to in Likutei Sichos. There's one other thing that comes up very often in the footnotes of Likutei Sichos, where the Rebbe refers to see Berliner's edition of Rashi. See Berliner's edition of Rashi. What's this? So that's what you have on the screen. You have on the screen over here an edition of Rashi ala Torah. On the left-hand side is a Hebrew title page. On the right-hand side is a German title page that is put out by a scholar named Avram Berliner in Taf Reish Chav Zayin, 1866. And as he writes on the title page, what is he coming to do? He's coming l'sakein hagirsois berashi. L'sakein hanuschois v'agirsois berashi u'litzayin es ha'asafes loyloi. And to note things that were added that aren't from Rashi. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So he's, I think, the first one who's what we call a critical edition, who's putting out a critical edition of Rashi. This is the first one to do this in 1866. Tafresh Chav Zayin, 1866. A number of decades later, he does a second edition of Rashi ala Torah, and here again he says, I'm using manuscripts, it's Mahadura Tinyana. It's the second edition, and in Likutei Sichos, the Rebbe actually uses both. Sometimes because there are things he has in the first one that he doesn't have in the second, there are things he has in the second and he doesn't have in the first, and so this often comes up in this project of getting involved in the text of Rashi. Okay. Now, we need to reach our conclusion, and our conclusion is to address a simple question here, and that is, how do we have variations in the first place? Why do we have variations between manuscripts? Why do we have variations between prints? What is happening over here? So obviously, sometimes we know there's the concept of a typo. A typo happens. And that's definitely a valid conversation when, as we saw before, the Rebbe suggested a certain word in the first print of Reggio de Calabria was a tolos hatfus. So that's a very valid thing. Obviously, a person has to be credentialed and a serious scholar to be able to say something like that. But that's a very valid thing. But by no means does that explain really what's going on over here. The nature of the variations cannot be explained by saying there's someone who fell asleep at the wheel or skipped a line or something like that. There are other things that are going on. So I want to point to two sichos where the Rebbe addressed this issue, and then with this we're going to close. So here is a sicha of Parshas Kisavoy. It's the second sicha in Likutei Sichos Chelek Tes, where the Rebbe is discussing a problem. It's a very obvious problem when you read Rashi. Rashi begins, and the context, again, doesn't matter. I'm not going to get into the specifics, just to give an overview. Rashi first says that the given word that he's talking about, Ein lahem eid b'mikra. There is no parallel at all to this particular word in Tanakh. Okay. Then Rashi continues, Umatsasi loy eid. And I found a parallel. So that's confusing. You say there is no parallel, and then you say, and I found a parallel. So the Rebbe says over here, hat men gekent einlernen. So perhaps the answer is, as der aid from pasuk is that this testimony, that this parallel that Rashi ultimately found, that happened later. I found it. But betchila, b'shasta ma'adura kama, when Rashi was writing his first version, then he didn't have any parallel. So he wrote, Ein lahem eid. This is the suggestion the Rebbe is making over here. What's the suggestion? The suggestion is something that comes up for other authors as well, like the Rambam, that it's not like you write the book and then it's done because you published it. No, you still have your master copy at home, and you're always making additions. And so there's a student that came on Sunday and copied your text, but you added something on Monday, and only the guy who copied it on Tuesday is going to get your addition. So maybe that's what happened here. Rashi first wrote, I have no parallel, okay? And then later he wrote, and I did find a parallel. And then in footnote 12 over here, the Rebbe says, and that would explain why we would say that in the first edition, here the Rebbe is referring to the Reggio print, in the first edition, you don't have the second half of this Rashi. The Matzasi I eventually found is not in. If you go back to that Reggio print, you're not going to see it. Why? Because this Reggio print is progeny from the Madura Kama before Rashi made the edition, and it manuscript after manuscript after manuscript until it reached this 1475 print, which is why that Matzasi and I eventually found the parallel is not there. This is what the Rebbe suggests here in the Sikha. The Rebbe rejects it not because the theory itself doesn't work. In fact, it does work. However, in this specific case, for reasons I don't want to get into right now, the Rebbe says, here it doesn't make sense. But for our purposes, what we get over here is, this is the beginning of a conversation of why are we having variations in Rashi between different manuscripts and prints. One of the explanations would be that Rashi added to his text, and so therefore some of them are progeny before the addition, some of them are progeny of after Rashi's addition, and that would be one way of explaining this. That's number one. There is another explanation, however, that the Rebbe alluded to in the Sicha of Shabbos Parshas HaYishlach, Yud Dalet Kislev, Tov Shin Lamed Aleph. And here, the Rebbe says as follows. I'm reading now from the non-Muga version of the Sicha. There are those who want to say that a certain section in Rashi, a few words, hat nish Rashi geschrieben. Rashi could not have written this. Nor Rashi's a Talmud hat das zugeschrieben. Rashi's student wrote this. Uvimizet, and indeed, evidence for this is, as in the Tfus Rishon von Rashi steht das Takenit. It's not there in the first edition. So what's happening here? Here we're getting an alternative explanation for why you would have a variation in Rashi. The alternative is that Rashi in fact never wrote it, not in his Madura Kama, not in his Madura Basra. Rashi never wrote it, but he had students who, on their copy of their Rashi, they had an interesting idea, and they added it on to the margin, and then eventually got copied, and then eventually made its way into Rashi from students adding things in. Says the Rebbe accommodates the idea as a possibility, but the Rebbe adds the following. And here's where I think there's a difference between the Rebbe discusses this and other Mefarshim. Other Mefarshim talk about a Talmud Toya. Hey, this guy didn't know what he's talking about. He's a student who didn't know what he's talking about. The Rebbe doesn't accept that approach. The Rebbe's approach, look what he says. Even if we're going to accept this idea that it didn't come from Rashi, still, I believe that it still has a connection to Rashi. Because a Talmud from Rashi is doch euch nicht gewen kein katlo kanya ba'agma. He's using here a language of the Gemara, someone who collects reeds in a swamp. In other words, Talmud of Rashi isn't a lowlife. Talmud of Rashi is someone who gets his teacher, who understands his teacher. And by the way, a Talmud of Rashi is first someone who literally learned by him, or is someone who follows in Rashi's footsteps and kochs and cares about his way of learning. Question, I'm not sure how exactly to interpret Talmud, but the point is, it's not Rashi himself. Says the Rebbe, I don't care, because it's still someone who is familiar with this derech. It's not that he just wrote anything on his margins of Rashi. He knew that Rashi is here for Ben Chamish Mikra, so then this student is also doing Ben Chamish Mikra. So maybe it's not the same level of Ben Chamish Mikra, whatever it is, but it still deserves to be part of the conversation. And so therefore in these Rashi sichos, the Rebbe even in these passages, we're getting over here, by the way, I should stress, we're getting over here an alternative theory. What's alternative theory? Why do we sometimes have variations? Maybe it came from a student, a later generation. Someone said, hey, I have a great idea. I have something we can add on to this. I think this is something Rashi perhaps would have liked to say himself. And eventually it made its way in. Are those to be rejected? Chas v'shalom, they should be rejected. Those are to be incorporated as well because they were written under the aura of Rashi, with the spirit of Rashi in mind, and so therefore they become part of the learning. They become part of the learning, and we analyze it the way we analyze a Rashi more or less, which the Rebbe pretty consistently does in his many talks on Rashi. So what is the takeaway of all of this? If you ask the question based on this, why is there diversity between different prints and manuscripts and Rashi? The answer is because people really cared about it. That's essentially the answer. Let's go through both possibilities. The first possibility is that Rashi himself went back and updated his work. Well, if Rashi is going back to update his work, what does that mean? This is really important to me. It's not one and done. I am going to go back and write on a new day, a new insight. I'm going to update it, and I'm going to update it, and I'm going to update it. So that shows us how important this work is, that Rashi himself, the great Rashi, isn't sufficing with his initial launch, but is constantly updating his pirush. That itself is quite an inspiring thing. But then let's go to the other theory. What's the other theory? That there are other people, so many people, who are learning Rashi, but they aren't only learning Rashi as passive recipients. They also are thinking on their own, maybe we can add this particular idea. I think that's consistent with Rashi's method of thinking. And because they're thinking that way and they write it onto the page, it eventually, some of these make their way into Rashi's text. So why is that happening? Again, because people are really caring about Rashi and they're really interested in doing it, and they're playing an active part in the project as well, bringing their own creativity into this. So either way, however you take it, whether it's Rashi himself doing it or it's because of others who may have added it in, the lesson is that Rashi matters. Rashi matters really much. It matters enough for Rashi to go back to it. It matters enough for the students to really care and to bring their own creativity into this. And so I think the lesson now, 60 years after the Rebbe started this campaign, I'll call it a campaign, of studying Rashi very, very exceptionally and very intently, that in our learning of the Parshas HaShavua, to be able to take a Rashi, and hopefully some of the things we learned here today could add a little chayas in that learning, so that we're able to learn the Parshas HaShavua and leben mit der Zeit in the way that we're supposed to. L'chaim. Is there this dramatic of a